What an extraordinary book and an extraordinary man who has lived a life driven by DNA, driven by genetics, but written a book called Horses, a 4,000-year genetic journey across the world. Ludovic Orlando is a very famous geneticist, it turns out. He's won the CNRS Silver Medal, which we don't know what it is, but he's the founding director of the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics of Toulouse at the University of Toulouse. He is French and spends a great deal of his intellectual time with other big brains across the world. Ludovic, I guess one of the things that most struck me about your book, first I thought, oh, a history of the horse. Oh, okay, I guess we all know there were those early little horses called the Pulowski or something. That's not what your book's about. Your book's about looking at the remnants of these horses that you have not personally been the archaeologist who found the remnants and figuring out where they fit in a big picture. And the more you found, the more you looked, and the more you looked, the more you found. And I can see that your life as an academic and as an intellectual never stops being challenging. And that's what this book feels like to me. It's constantly challenging. You think, okay, I got that. And then you're, but wait, there's a whole nother idea here. Is that what happened when you wrote it? Did more and more unfold, or did you know right from the beginning how many topics were going to be in this DNA search for the horse?
No, it's a bit of both actually, and thanks for having me. I'm really
Pleasure.
excited to discuss with you here. So a bit of both, I would say. The book reflects really what research is about, at least in my experience, which is a constant daily surprise to some extent. And so I've tried to really relate what I've experienced myself in the last 10 years when we were tracking the origins of the domestic horse. And indeed, it was a roller coaster, right? It was like really every day was different. And it took us many years, in fact, to have the answers to very simple questions such as when, where, how, and who domesticated the horse for the first time. But at the same time, as I was writing the book, there is a bit of that, of course, but there is also, oh, I need to give food for thoughts for my readers. And so there were a number of things that I did not want to do in that book, which is pretty much what you find in all the millions of other books that exist on horses. So what I wanted to do is to try to explain how we could use DNA really to track not only the history of the horse, but in fact our own history, the history of humans, because horses and us have been so intertwined during the last 4,000 years.
Yes, I'm sorry. The dog is now barking at something. And part of me wondered why not the dog? Because it seems that the horse would be in a way more challenging, bigger bones, bigger teeth. There's a lot of study of their teeth, which was fascinating, whether they were ridden by men based on their teeth and the DNA of their teeth and how much their teeth were worn down. But you also give this sense of your own sense of joy and discovery in looking at what others have found because it is a multidisciplinary experience. And I don't know if that's true of a lot of science, but you make that clear at some point how many people from many different lands with completely different obsessive passions. I don't mean obsessive other than just a descriptive word. You are going to get to the bottom of the thing that interests you most, but wait, you need the guy that does the archaeology and the person who's the geologist, right? You must have made so many friends and colleagues around the world who wanted your brain as the DNA guy.
No, absolutely. You're spot on, actually. The when you study something as global as the history of us and the horse, of course, the world is your playground, basically. So you have to travel the world and meet new people. And of course, I have that part of the book when I joke about we don't speak the same language, but in fact we do, because
Yeah.
we have the horse in common. We have the passion of that animal in common. And just because of that, it was possible to move hundreds of people towards the same objective. So you're absolutely right to say that this is absolutely not just my own initiative. This work took a few hundreds of people, by and large, over 10 years of their life, committed to really answer and track the evolutionary path of us and the horse.
And that's why I say obsessive. It's not to say that you all are neurotic or you have like a disorder that you're obsessed. But in fact, you weren't obsessed by horses. living,
Yeah.
breathing horses, the opposite. And you talk about that at one point. You say, my wife, who's so scared of horses she can't even go near them, said, you know what, Ludovic, you're going to have to get on one of these animals. If you're going to spend a decade of your life looking at them, you need to know what they feel like. So I realized at some point during the book, because you never do talk about your passion for their shiny loveliness, that the world may be divided into those who see them in a kind of at an arm's length way, or those of us who we see a horse, we just want to kiss it right on the muzzle, like Equus. We just want to be the horse, on the horse, with the horse.
Yeah.
So what was it? Talk about what your experience was like when you went to have this riding lesson.
So you can imagine, I was 44 when I started to learn how to ride a horse. And of course, at those lessons, you only have teenagers, right? So it's a lesson of humility to start with,
Yes.
right? As,
Yes.
as the researcher, you have to actually start from square zero. But in my life, so even though I started to ride at 44, in my life, I got many opportunities, in fact, to learn earlier. But I was always, it seems, choosing something else. For example, when I was at high school, I could do a day of every week doing some sport, and that was either horse or sailing, basically. And I took sailing because to me it was more appealing. And it came on and on many times during my brief career, actually. But at some point, I came across that animal, the horse, first, I should say, for the sort of intellectual joy of studying the horse, because it was so important to human history, but at the same time, it is also a very important cultural and biological heritage to preserve, to safeguard, actually. So, lots of food for thinking and how to succeed in doing that. But I realized at some point, actually, my wife realized that you cannot just be theoretical with animals. And it's obvious, obviously, right? So I started to realize that there were many other dimensions than just the intellectual when it comes to horses. And people knew that. Riders knew that, obviously, that you have this absolutely thrilling and delicate feeling of being understood by another species than our own,
Yeah.
basically. And that's really something. I guess you have the same experience with dogs and with other animals, obviously. So understanding this actually added a lot more dimensions to my work because I'm the DNA guy. I only think DNA. I'm only
Yeah.
think about genealogies and how genes
Yeah.
are passed on through generations. But the minute that you start thinking about language, communication, feeling even, the whole history of the animal changes basically. And you would understand why time and time again, over thousands of years, people found in love with that animal and wanted to cherish it as much as they could.
Yeah, it's a wonderful way to see a scientist who has self-awareness, which is you. You called yourself at one point in the book a lab rat.
Mhm.
Somebody else was out in the green field and you were the lab rat. And you were so engaging. You clearly were not a mad scientist with a white coat who never came out of the lab in fluorescent light. But it was charming that you called yourself that. It's funny, the history, not funny, but interesting, that the French culture is extremely equine. When I
Mhm.
was a little girl living in Italy and then for a little while in France, the first place I learned to ride was in Deauville on the beach.
Mm.
And when I went back many decades later to the Deauville Film Festival, that riding arena, the size of a swimming pool, more or less, an Olympic swimming pool, was still there. So it wasn't just teenagers when you were learning, very young, differently than other cultures with bareback riding. Now, I don't know if that's all across France, but it has a huge cultural history with
No,
riding.
you're right. You're right about Deauville, but that's in Normandy, right? So
Yes.
northwestern part of the country, and this is the horse nation there. So that's
Yeah.
very typical of that particular region. Other regions in my country, of course, you will find a lot of horses around and people like very used to ride horses, but this is not as popular of an animal as dogs are, even like I would say cows, actually.
But it's still in your literature. It's in your, you have a national for dressage where the horses are
Oh.
trained and it all looks quite military and organized and it's brilliant and so more and people can go there. I've been, people that love horses have been. You other people want to see a museum. I want to see the French horses that are so amazing. So it's great that you were doing this in a country where you didn't have that personal attachment and passion to the horses. but it's got to be in your DNA, in your cultural DNA. So, one of the things that's extraordinary about the book, so we read along, and it's really quite wonderful because you are saucy, and your translator did an amazing job. So you have a chapter called the early chapter called The Origin Horse. And then the next chapter is The Other Origin Horse, because in fact, there were all these origin horses that were being discovered, these things that didn't look like today's horse. But then we go along and you have lots of wonderful historical information about horses and humans and the DNA and how things evolved and how their remains are found and whether they were eaten. That was fascinating. The whole thing with the archaeology. Were they eaten? Were they slaughtered? A lot were slaughtered, but were they slaughtered at the place they were trained and lived with, or was it out in the wild? It was great. It really, so much food for thought, as you said, so much food for thought. But then you get to modern times, and it's a bit chilling. And this is
Mm,
where you, as the DNA guy, are front and center. And I'm thinking, ooh, Ludovic could be very much in demand, and people could be throwing money at you to help
mm,
figure out both the polo ponies, which, as you point out in the book, in Argentina, are as important as soccer players, which I didn't
sure.
really understand. I knew there were beautiful men
Mhm,
who were polo players who always wind up getting very wealthy and attractive social wives. That's a ridiculous sort of cliche, but there it is. Cliches have a reason for existing. But I didn't know that the ponies themselves had this enormous national issue,
mm,
pride, what have you. And then you talk about the English thoroughbred,
mm.
which in Australia, England, and America has been kept as a creature under glass. Let's talk about which one do you want to talk about first, the polo ponies or the thoroughbreds? Because the DNA that's involved and the few in the English thoroughbred, the 12 horses from which all other thoroughbreds are descended, is frightening from a DNA, from a, you know,
Yeah, I mean, we can start
aspect.
with the thoroughbreds if you want. So the
Yeah,
thoroughbreds, this is a breed, of course, of the fastest horses on the planet, right? Basically, it was bred out by the British people, say from the second half of the 18th century
yes,
onwards. And so we know that breed so well that we have even a genealogical book of each and every crossing that has been made to
yes,
actually shape the modern population of those animals. And this is clearly what people who do not know too much about horses will picture, right? The sort of super fast horse, the very popular races and everything. But at the same time in the book, I explore what happened to their genes in the last 250 years, and also the sort of silent race that is going on before the race even, because those
yes,
animals are bred very specifically, and you will have any time that goes through is a sort of investment that could be lost or that could be a winning investment. So I was amused by this sort of parallel between the racetrack and the race that people do when they try to breed the lucky few ones, right?
yes,
Those that will win millions of dollars of races, basically. So when it comes to DNA, what we found in our work is that in the last 200 years, that's true for thoroughbreds, but that's definitely true more generally for pretty much all the breeds around the planet, is that there has been a loss of diversity, of genetic diversity.
yes,
And that comes to the fact that that relates to the fact that we have bred the animals that had the same kind with each other, the fast with the fast ones, the small with the
right.
small ones, the tall with the tall ones. And when you do that, obviously there is a lots of combinations that could have happened that have not, basically, because you restrict those who will have kids together. And so by simply this cherry picking thing that we've done, we've lost quite significant diversity, about 16% worldwide, which sounds like a great deal, in fact. And so it would not be too much problematic if genetic diversity was not something that could help the future potential of the species, basically, because when environmental changes, basically, if you have different versions of your genes, maybe some versions will actually fit better the new environment. So actually already losing diversity comes with a red flag. But at the same time, for the thoroughbreds, it's not just a loss of diversity, is that because those who win the races are so popular, they will sire the next generations a lot more than any other random horse, basically. And so that means that their gene versions will get passed on more and more rapidly to the next generations. In other words, some and only a few genetic versions of the thoroughbred text will be transmitted through generations. And because of that, a lot of the times, some horses will have the very same ancestors. And in fact, that ancestor will come up many times in their genealogies. And that
Right.
creates what we call inbreeding. And inbreeding could be nasty because, as we know from even human genetics, right? Because if you have one copy of a gene that is a deleterious copy, a copy of a gene that doesn't work really well, then if that ancestor transmits that version to you two ways in your genealogies, then you will have only that copy. And if you only have a defectuous copy, then probably your biology is not going to be optimal, and therefore you may develop some genetic diseases or disorders, or you may have difficulties to even reproduce yourself. So at the end of the day, all this is not just theoretical knowledge, it's also a sort of assessment of what is the sort of genetic health of any breed or the thoroughbred breeds in that example, and how could we geneticists leverage the DNA information we get to inform about more fruitful prospects for the future of the breed.
And you talk a lot about the horrors of thoroughbred breeding and the fact that these horses are run when they're 2 and 3, when some of them are really only 1. You very correctly that all thoroughbred horses are given the same birthday. Imagine
Mhm.
if that happened with people. So everybody that's born in the year of 2026, let's say, is considered to be born on January 1st. So, of course, the one born on December 30th is actually all a year younger. And that's what happens with thoroughbreds. And they have delicate legs to begin with. And that's what's been passed on. And the thoroughbred breeding is so strict, nothing can be done with artificial insemination. It has to be a live cover. And people only want those winning horses, which, as you also point out, but if a very winning horse doesn't throw winning babies, in no time they stop breeding to them. And one very famous horse
Mhm.
wound up at the slaughterhouse in Australia. So just like very successful show horses or that were once race horses, and then some of them become show jumpers, and then if they don't do well, they wind up giving lessons maybe, and then they wind up at the slaughterhouse or on a horrible track. And that's what happens when you don't have genetic diversity. And in dog breeding, inbreeding is looked at as, oh, that's terrible. And of course, in, I don't know, English history and the Shakespearean plays, you weren't supposed to be breeding with your cousin because then you became an idiot, chinless wonder who was useless. And yet, that's what the thoroughbred horse breeders have agreed to do. Let's keep it with the same 12 ancestors as if that were a good thing. And the horses are breaking down and the horses are suffering. And you also have an amazing description of how thoroughbred breeding is done, or any high level breeding, in terms of the preparation of the mare, physical, mental, environment, and then the stud, and the fact that sometimes they need help with a special tool to even insert themselves into the mare. And she's
Right.
covered with certain blankets so she doesn't get injured and hobbled and twitched on her lip. It's, oh, this isn't feeling so good. It's not 2 horses out in a field.
Yeah.
Now
No,
it's
no,
too big a.
absolutely. Absolutely, but at the same time, and I insist a lot on that part of the book, there is a whole chapter about that. But in that very same chapter, I actually acknowledge that some breeders, in fact, the majority of the breeders, do the right thing.
Yes.
So we could get
Yes.
nasty, but at the same time, most of us are horse lovers and are trying to only do the good thing for the animal. But of course, because of what is at stake, a lot of money, obviously, you will have deviant behavior that will rise, basically. So I would not be happy to let people think that the whole breeding industry has to get trashed, basically. On the very
No, right.
contrary. So lots of people, the vast majority of the professionals are truly professionals and they really care about the animals. But it's true that we have some examples of, as you said yourself, race winners who became 5 years later totally abandoned. And actually, some of them, there is one very famous that ended up as a sausage in Japan, basically. So we have to realize that as everything with human life, right, there are two sides of every problem, and that what I guess my book could contribute to, I hope, is to increase the public awareness of the challenges that breeding animals come with.
But you also do point out the very wonderful organizations that have sprung up for retired thoroughbreds, New York State and other places, and they have a good rest of their life. But I think the wake-up call isn't to the public, in my opinion. It's to the breeders who, while they mean well, meaning they want to breed winning horses, they don't understand genetics and DNA. They're not that much smarter than your average bear. They just know what they know from their daddy and their granddaddy who've all been breeding forever, and they know that this line works or that line doesn't, or make sure the mare is the right size, or whatever those simplistic things are that have nothing to do with DNA. Because
Mhm.
when this folklore is passed down amongst breeders and owners or those who buy the horses, it's just that, oh, there was a winner in the history, in the family tree, not what does that mean about the DNA. And I think that's really what your book points out, that the weaknesses aren't necessarily that it's going to get a disease, but just that the entire animal is weakened, just like humans would be if we were allowed to breed with our cousins. We could all be look really good and be good at
Yeah,
whatever it is we do, but it wouldn't take long before we were all useless.
no, absolutely. At the same time, I'm the geneticist here, and of course, I believe in DNA, if I can say that, obviously. But
Sure.
when it comes to the elite sport, basically, all of them have good genes to some extent, right? Like pretty much all of
Yes.
them. And
Yes.
any kind of professional athlete will tell you that the mental state matters as much as the shape that they are trained in, right? So basically, in fact, if you look at the time for winning a race, thoroughbreds, it hasn't improved much in the last 30 years, right? So that means
Interesting.
that, and there's a lot of debates about, is it because we reached the physical limit of the animal, or is it because that they don't need to even push themselves too much more, actually,
Right. They're
right?
already at their max. The
Yeah,
other
exactly.
thing you have in the book, just because we only have a little bit of time left, is fascinating stuff about cloning, which is going on with the Argentinian polo ponies. And we've all heard a little bit about, I don't know, Barbara Streisand cloning her Bichon Frise or something, $50,000 or some such number. But you talk about cloning and what it is and how it works and how precise it has to be and what a science experiment it is. And yet
It is.
the polo people are willing to do it.
No, absolutely. They do it. Actually, they have done it for years now
No,
for the
which
polo
we didn't
industry.
know.
And in fact, some of the best polo player ever had whole teams of cloned
Yes.
polo horses,
Yes.
basically, right? And actually, when you read some of his interviews, basically, he says that he can feel the difference between the different animals, even though they all have the very same genes. So this is fascinating, actually. And that actually stresses again that it comes to a lot more than the genes, the performance that any
Yes.
individual makes, basically. But when it comes to polo, and in general, in fact, so not only now we have the technology to clone, which is to make copycats of the same,
Right.
which can have some advantages if you love that one, if you like the body shape or the performance, then you can actually try to copy it at will. But now we have the technology to even edit the clone. So that means that to actually copy almost the same, but change a few bits here and there. And actually, they are doing that for the polo now. They are trying to get some genetic versions of some very specific genes that can make them a little bit faster or a little bit tamer or these sort of things. So
Right.
you realize that now genetics and the power of biotechnology in general can actually help breed out a new kind of horse way faster than the sort of trial and error that we've just discussed. When you're a breeder, you're trying what you think is going to be good, but actually, with those technology now, people can try to do some experiments and really assess what works and what doesn't work, and even try to do the experiment many times to actually compare
Yes.
with big numbers what are going to be the consequences. So I think it's a sort of an eye opener for the public as well to realize that we live in that time period where those things are becoming possible, sure, for the horse, but in fact, virtually, because DNA is actually universal for any kind of animals we interact with.
Exactly. Dogs in particular, and kitty cats. We've run out of time. Here's the beautiful book, Ludovic Orlando, Horses, a 4,000-year genetic journey across the world. There is so much to be learned and savored in this book, and so much food for thought. Ludovic, you're doing great work. I hope another 10 years and soon you'll have a horse in your backyard for yourself as a pet.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Lovely to spend time with you. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for your time.